Hi everybody, it's Ian here and welcome to this webinar from the We Brave Leaders series, which is Overcoming Imposter Syndrome and Unlocking Your Leadership Potential. Now, what we're going to be learning about today is why rising leaders have to overcome imposter syndrome, why it's so important to you as a rising leader. We're going to look at what is imposter syndrome and why it matters so much, where it comes from and how it shows up, some of the mindsets that foster imposter syndrome and how we can beat those, and also 5 actionable techniques to overcome imposter syndrome. And follow me all the way to the end, and then there's a little gift from me if you make it all the way to the end of this webinar. Now, imposter syndrome itself is surprisingly common. It may feel like something that only affects you, but actually, according to research, here we can see 50% of tech leaders have reported experiencing imposter syndrome at some point in their career. And they're joined by 70% of C-suite leaders and 75% of female leaders, because this is something that seems to affect women more than it does men. These all report feeling imposter syndrome at some point in their career, and often many times. So each time they move onwards with their career, up another step in their career, imposter syndrome can rear its head yet again. Rising leaders are particularly prone to imposter syndrome. There are a number of reasons why. So you're experiencing new role pressures, maybe you have limited experience in that role, you may have come from being a master of something to a novice in your new role, and that leads to self-doubt. And also, as you go up the ladder, you experience increased pressure as well as changing demands and styles of work as well. Now, imposter syndrome shows up for different people in different ways, and there are many different side effects. These are some of the common effects of imposter syndrome. You probably aren't going to be experiencing all of them, but there are perfectionism, fear of failure, a difficulty in really accepting praise. So even when people are telling us that we're doing a good job, we're kind of going, I'm not willing to accept that, or I'm not willing to accept it out loud, because pride comes before a fall. Excessive self-criticism, where even if we're doing a good job, we're really obsessing over the little details that we didn't quite get the way that we wanted in there. And sometimes that will lead to burnout, decreased drive or productivity, a hesitation and a reluctance to take on more responsibility and new responsibilities for greater fear of failure, a reluctance in asking for help because that is seen as a sign of failure, and feeling underprepared or inadequate. So you can see that imposter syndrome starts out in a fairly innocuous way with a little bit of perfectionism, a little bit of a fear of failure, and then can lead to quite important and quite serious conditions around burnout and decreased drive and productivity. So how do we define imposter syndrome? So imposter syndrome is that feeling that you're a fraud and that you don't deserve success, even when all the evidence points to the contrary. So there's plenty of evidence to show that you're capable and competent, but it's something that you feel like you're the fraud and you don't deserve that success. So often that can sound like, I just got lucky, or I don't belong here, and it can lead to feelings of self-doubt, to fear of failure, and a reluctance for you to take credit for your clear accomplishments. But here's the thing. Imposter syndrome is a belief, and once we know and we accept that, what we also know is that that belief can be changed. Now, imposter syndrome loves rising leaders in particular, so people who are growing in their careers, either stepping into a brand new role or contemplating taking on a more senior position. There are kind of 2 parts here. So imposter syndrome comes from how you feel internally and also from the environment around you. Now, internally, you're going through a period where you may be moving from master to beginner all over again. And that's going to be hard. You've probably built your reputation on knowing lots of things. So stepping into a brand new role where everybody around you seems to know more than you is always going to be a difficult thing to do. And that can lead to feelings of being unprepared, being inadequate, which is particularly difficult if you've built your reputation on being super prepared and always on top of your game. And of course, as your team size grows, it's no longer possible to be in the detail and the weeds of everything that's going on. And that loss of control, that feeling that you can't control every part of what your team is doing, can also be a real challenge for rising leaders. And the second part comes from the pressure of things around you. So increasingly we have a competitive work environment. If you don't want to take this job, there are plenty of others who would. You probably had to fight quite hard to get the job that you have, and you're probably working hard in order to keep it. There are high expectations, and as we go up in leadership ranks, quite often the level of support kind of just fades away in there. So you may be feeling more vulnerable because you can't be quite as open with people about the things that you find difficult. So where does imposter syndrome actually come from? So it comes from, we think, 3 different sources. So the first is around early life experiences. So in your earlier life, when you were a child growing up, you may have experienced perfectionism. You may have been subject to comparison, by comparison to siblings, comparison to others in school. You may have grown up in an environment where you were criticized, and unpredictable validation means where love and care and attention would have been given to you conditional on you pleasing somebody else. So, you might have got praise for coming home with a brilliant school report, but if you didn't come home with a brilliant school report, that praise wasn't really there. The second part is around our personality. So some of us are just more wired towards experiencing imposter syndrome. That can be to do with self-esteem, perfectionism. Some of us are just wired to feel a high sensitivity to criticism. We may have high empathy levels. And then the third area is around our social and cultural environment. So some of us growing up may have experienced bias, stereotypes. We may have experienced or are experiencing a workplace with high competitive drives and where there's limited positive feedback in there. Now, the trigger behind imposter syndrome is your inner critic, and here we're going to call that the judge. And there are 3 kinds of judge. So we have the judge of self, the judge of others, and the judge of circumstance. Let's just break those down. So the judge of self is that voice inside your head that says, I am not good enough, I am not worthy of this position, of this role, of this place in this company. The judge of others is that voice inside you that says, when they find out who they've hired, they're going to be so disappointed. So this is where we judge and predict other people's reactions and the way that other people are thinking. And then judge of circumstance is that kind of voice that says, it's a fluke, they made a mistake. What were they doing on that interview day? Good things don't happen to people like me. What we need to know is that in reality, this voice of the inner critic or the judge is a lie. The judge is a liar. And the judge lies in order to, in theory, keep you safe. So the lies of the judge are, you need me. I am there and I say these things to you in order to protect you and to keep you safe from harm, physical harm or emotional harm. And without me kicking you up the backside, you would become lazy and ignorant. That's why I do these things to you. That's why I make you feel this bad. But I do it because I will keep you safe from danger and safe from harm. And the primal wiring in our brain is always to keep us safe from harm. But what we also know is that the reality of the judge is far from that simple premise of I will keep you safe, because what the judge does is keeps you within the boundary of what you already know, because what you know is safe, prevents you from taking calculated risks, in there holds you back from your true potential, because the future is scary, because it's unknown, and the judge focuses always on everything that is wrong, and very rarely on anything that is right. Now, the judge and the inner critic actually comes from a really ancient part of our brain. We've got a little cutaway here. And in the tiny bit in the middle, there's a little thing there which is called the amygdala. Now, it's thought that the amygdala was developed as a kind of threat response detector type thing, and from days when you may have had to escape a saber-toothed tiger when you're out hunting far from the cave. The amygdala doesn't really do very much in the way of thinking. It's just there to instinctively sense danger and threat. And then what it does is it kicks off a chain reaction in which two hormones are secreted, and those are adrenaline and cortisol. You've probably heard of both of them. Now, adrenaline, the role of adrenaline is to increase our heart rate, to prime our muscles, create a form of stress which actually limits our thinking and focuses on escaping from a saber-toothed tiger. And cortisol numbs the pain. Really handy if you need to escape from a saber-toothed tiger. Most of us in our office don't actually need to do that these days. And the thing is, adrenaline and cortisol take a while to flush through the body. And when they don't flush through properly, they're actually toxic for our organs and for our living being. So generally speaking, if you need to escape from a saber-toothed tiger, you need to get out of danger quickly. All of this is a really good part of your brain. But on a day-to-day basis in the office, this is not a great way of thinking. And the inner critic, or the judge, conspires with things which we call saboteurs to stop us from growing. Now, saboteurs are kind of personality traits, and they come from strengths, but they're kind of like strengths that are overused. And they have three motivations. A motivation of independence. I'm going to keep myself safe by keeping my distance from others. Acceptance, which is I'm going to keep myself safe by being accepted into the tribe because it's always safer in numbers, and then the motivation of security for the same thing. And they show up in different ways for different people. We're showing you 9 saboteurs here on this grid, but what they do is limit our thinking. So at a point where we need to be at our most creative, the saboteurs narrow our thinking down, which really accentuates that feeling that comes from imposter. Now, the ancient part of our brain is all about fear and threat and keeping us safe. So when we want to summon up creative responses, we're not going to get that from the left part of the brain. That brainstem, the limbic system, is there simply to keep us safe. It's not the place where we're going to get our most creative thoughts and the solutions to our problems. But we're not going to be able to do that with the left part of our brain. What we need instead is to increase and generate energy from our sage brain. Sage brain is in the right hand side of our brain. It comes from an area called the middle prefrontal cortex, and it's about empathy circuitry. And empathy circuitry allows us to be able to think wider than just ourselves, look at the circumstances around us, look at the behaviour of others, and then through that to find creative solutions through challenges that we face. So here's a question for you which is true. This thing is bad. I want you to think of a challenge now that you have in your work life at the moment. Which is true? This thing is bad or this thing is good? Give you a moment to think. This thing is bad. This thing is good. Now, the answer between these two is whichever you believe comes true. Let's just deconstruct that for a moment. So if you look at a circumstance in there that you have going on in the office at the moment and you believe that this circumstance is bad, then your brain will lock on to everything that is bad and negative about those circumstances. It is very likely to look backwards and forwards, so it's likely to go back to who was to blame for this, why was this not predicted, and it's likely to look forward into this is going to be a disaster, all the terrible things that are going to happen as a result of this. And the reality then is that all your actions will be focused around that negative backwards and forward sense. If we believe that something is going to be good, then our energy instead is focused more optimistically on the things that we can do rather than the things that we can't do or didn't do as well. So whichever you believe, this thing is bad or this thing is good, will come true. So let's bring it to life then with an example of Sarah. So Sarah, recently promoted in the tech company to a managerial role. Her first leader of leaders role, has always struggled with imposter syndrome. And despite being highly qualified on paper, she's constantly felt like she wasn't capable of leading her new team. And her inner judge, so her inner critic, kept reminding her of every small mistake that she made, and to the point where she regretted having taken this new leadership role that she had been awarded. And her saboteur, which is called the hyperachiever, was demanding perfection, was telling her that the only way that she could earn the respect of people around her was by achieving more. And she was worried that her team would see her as unqualified, and then she feared failure at every turn. Now, Sarah's saboteur-driven actions based on that feedback resulted in her over-preparing for meetings, so staying up until the early hours of the morning, rehearsing presentations, which really meant that when she arrived at the presentation, she wasn't at her freshest, she wasn't on top of her game, she forgot some of what she wanted to say, the point she wanted to land, she was irritable with people who were just gently challenging some of her ideas, uncharacteristically so. She also tried to avoid difficult conversations with members of her team for fear of saying the wrong thing, for fear of upsetting people, and even when things were going right for her, when projects were landing on time, she dismissed those and put them down to just sheer luck, that something dreadful was going to happen just around the corner. So now let's think about you. On your worst days, what kind of saboteur feels like it's your default behaviour? Are you the controller who needs to have every level of detail nailed down in order to feel comfortable? Are you the hyperachiever for whom there is no goal that can be big enough? As soon as you've achieved one thing, you have to go on to the next, because that's how people recognise you and validate you and say that you're a great person. Or maybe you're a stickler, so you're just on top of the detail. You're the person who goes around checking everybody else's numbers to make sure that they're right, because somebody somewhere will definitely have made a mistake. Or maybe you're the pleaser. You're that person who wants to make sure that everybody is happy, and so you're constantly spending your energy running around trying to find out what everybody else wants and what they all think about how you can make everybody happy. Maybe you're the hypervigilant, the worrier, the person who's always looking around the corner, trying to predict where the next level of danger is going to come from, where the next disaster is going to happen. Or maybe you're the restless person, that person who just can't sit still, and you're always thinking about where's the next party, where is it going on, why are people having conversations over there and you're not involved. Maybe you're the avoider. Maybe on your worst day, you're that person who just feels like, do you know what, if I just pull a paper bag over my head for a while and it'll all just blow over, and then hopefully I can come back when the storm has passed. Or maybe you're the victim, that these things always happen to me, good things never go my way. Or maybe you're the hyper-rational, so when you're put under pressure, you're the person who will argue with logic, even though you know deep inside that sometimes decisions need to be made with people in mind as well. The thing is, we all have really bad days, and we all then default to certain kinds of behaviours, and understanding those defaults and behaviours can be the key to overcoming what we think is going on is imposter syndrome, but actually what we need to do is gain control of those saboteurs instead. So here's your 5 actionable steps that we're going to look at now. So step number 1 is about spotting the lie of the judge, because if you can't hear the judge, you can't stop the judge. So if you want to beat imposter syndrome, you've got to be able to hear it. So the first thing is to hear the judge, hear the inner critic, hear the lie in there, and call it firmly a liar. You are not doing these things to keep me safe. Really. You say you are, but you are not. Because until we come to terms with wanting to call this a lie, we're never going to take the actions, truly take the deep actions that we need to overcome imposter syndrome. The second one is about recentering our brain at that point. So once we've seen the lie, we need to flush all those negative thoughts out of our head. So I'm going to give you a quick exercise now to try out. We're going to do this live on the call. So if you're comfortable right now, you can just close your eyes. And if you don't want to close your eyes, you can just gaze into the distance, unfocused in there. And you can take one hand and hold it like this, and you can take the finger of the other hand, and I want you to just start tracing a circle around that hand. Now, as you trace the circle around the hand, feel that different kind of like tingling as the finger is going around. And notice all the grooves inside the palm of your hand, the ridges, the whorls, as you go round. And you may notice that some parts of the inside of your palm are warm and some are cool to the touch. Notice the change in temperature as you move your finger around, and gradually make your finger run in smaller circles and smaller circles until you reach a point in the middle, and then stop. And then if you've closed your eyes at that point, then you can come back to me. Okay. So that is just one of many very simple centering techniques. Will just allow you to recenter your brain, ready to kind of take some really sage action, but also to calm our breathing down as well, which is quite important in there. We need to kind of oxygenate everything as we go through this. Step number 3 here is about empathizing. So one of the things with imposter syndrome is that we're very critical of ourselves, and what we need to do is to develop greater levels of self-empathy. Now, the strange thing with people with imposter syndrome is that quite often if they saw somebody else in the same amount of pain, they would rush over and comfort and try to help them. But you're unlikely to do that with yourself. And why? Well, who knows why, but what we do need is greater self-empathy. So first step here is about detaching some of the things that we think is going on from being who we are to observing something in ourselves. So if we say, I am stressed, I am noticing feelings of stress. I am anxious, I am noticing that I am becoming anxious, irritated, annoyed. Because noticing that detaches that sense away from who we are, which then means that we can do something about this. And what I'd like you to do is to think about, what would you say to that person who's experiencing imposter syndrome right now? And how would you encourage and comfort them? So some of this is about learning to reframe as well. So instead of saying, for example, I failed here, so I am not capable, a sensible reframe could be, I'm growing. This is part of my growth. I'm proud of the effort I put in here. Sure, I know not everything went according to plan, but I have learnt so much through this experience, and I know that it will get better. That reframe from I failed, so I'm not capable, through to I am growing is what it takes. Step 4 is about celebrating our achievements. So here this one is as simple as taking a notebook. I've usually got plenty around. Let's have a look on the desk. A nice one here, red and black. Hold it up to the camera, one of these. And you can create in one of those a simple success log. So every day you just note down one thing that went well, one thing that you learned, and one way that you helped somebody. The act of writing it down is super important here, because the speed at which we write and the speed at which we think are quite different. The act of writing it down forces us to slow down and absorb the words that we're writing. And bit by bit, it will start building a mental muscle inside your head to tell you and remind you of who you are, the things you do well, the things that other people rely on you for, and your capacity to grow new capability even when you meet something that you don't yet know. And step 5 here is about shifting from judgment to being curious. So instead of labeling something as just being bad, or I am bad, or I am inadequate, or I have failed, and quite often this is for people who, if you're really sensitive to feedback, for example, instead of feeling I am inadequate, or I take that feedback quite literally, evoke curiosity. So curiosity instead asks questions around the experience. So what can I learn from this? What's the opportunity? What new perspective is somebody giving me? Remember, I can take a perspective, I don't have to act on it, but what new perspective are they giving me? And what new learning and what experiments can I try as a result of this? So let's recap what we've covered, because time is zipping away. Why rising leaders must overcome imposter syndrome, what is imposter syndrome and why it matters, where it comes from, how it shows up, critical mindset traps and how to beat them, and 5 actionable techniques for you to overcome imposter syndrome. Now, what you can do from here on in is you can apply what you've learned today and just go for it. Try any of these things, watch the webinar again, or even better is book some time with me. So I have a service where we can have a 30-minute Zoom session, and live in that session we will go through an assessment of your individual saboteurs so I can help you understand which ones are more prominent for you and how they impact your imposter syndrome. And then some quick strategies for overcoming imposter syndrome for good. That's completely free. I'm going to show you a link in a moment to my diary, and you can book that in, and in 30 minutes you'll come out much better informed with no obligation. But here's the thing. 90% of everybody who's watching this webinar will take absolutely no action. We know that from research, because your imposter syndrome is already telling you that you can't fix this. Imposter syndrome is part of you and that you need to live with it forever. And I have to say to you, that's so not true. So don't be part of the 90%. So let me help you out even more. And within 48 hours, if you ask for my support in 48 hours, and I'll show you in a moment how to do that, I will give you my Braver Leadership Workbook for free. So normally I can sell that for $47. I just want to start you on your journey to be a braver leader by giving something away. And here are the links that you need. So the QR code on the left-hand side is for my Brave Leadership Workbook. So now's the time to just grab scan of that one. And then the QR code on the right-hand side is if you want to book yourself a 30-minute assessment of your individual saboteurs. Whilst I'm on that screen as well, just draw your attention to my podcast series, We Brave Leaders podcast series, with more actionable tips around imposter syndrome and various things around that as well. Okay. And there you have it. So our time is up for today. I hope you've enjoyed this seminar on the We Brave Leaders series, which is all about overcoming imposter syndrome and unlocking your leadership potential. My name is Ian Brown. I hope to see you again soon. Bye for now.